It was a crisp Saturday morning in the small town of Maplewood, a place where life moved at a leisurely pace. The air buzzed with the sounds of kids playing, dogs barking, and the occasional hum of a leaf blower. On a public basketball court near the park, a group of children, aged 9 to 12, played an enthusiastic game. Despite their competitive banter, the kids were a tight-knit bunch. They came from all corners of Maplewood, their differences dissolving as they bonded over basketball. It wasn't about winning. It was about being together, enjoying the freedom of the weekend. Their laughter rang through the air as they dribbled, passed, and attempted awkward slam dunks. Across the street, George Sanders, a retired factory worker in his early 60s, sat on his porch. His face was lined with years of hard work and the bitterness of a lonely retirement. George had lived in Maplewood for decades, watching the neighborhood change. He didn't like it. Seeing a group of kids, he sipped from a mug of black coffee, his gaze fixed on the court. He didn't smile at the children's joy. Instead, his face hardened, his brow furrowed as he watched them laugh and play. The noise grated on him, their shouts and cheers like an unwelcome intrusion on his otherwise quiet morning. George muttered to himself, his thoughts circling. They're too loud. They're going to ruin the whole day. But it wasn't just the noise that bothered him. It was something deeper, something he didn't fully understand or want to admit. Some of the kids didn't look like they belonged to him. Their carefree happiness stirred something in George, not envy but a discomfort rooted in his own insecurities and prejudices. As the game grew louder, George's irritation boiled over. Grumbling about disrespect and rules, he grabbed his phone and called the local police. He reported a group of rowdy kids causing a disturbance, making vague accusations that painted them as troublemakers. "Hello, police," he said, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "There's a group of kids on the basketball court at Maplewood Park. They're being rowdy, shouting, causing a disturbance. Can you send someone to check it out?" Hanging up the phone, George sat back in his chair, satisfied. He convinced himself he was doing the right thing, keeping the neighborhood quiet, keeping it safe. The air around the basketball court was filled with shouts of excitement as the kids played on, oblivious to what was coming. Ethan had just made an impressive pass to Maya, who executed a flawless layup, earning her cheers and a round of high fives from the group. The carefree moment hung in the air, punctuated by the steady rhythm of sneakers against asphalt and the sharp, echoing bounce of the basketball. But then, the faint wail of sirens reached their ears, distant at first but growing louder by the second. The kids stopped mid-play, their heads turning in unison toward the sound. It was unusual to hear sirens in Maplewood, especially near their park. The rhythmic bouncing of the basketball ceased, the orange ball rolling slowly to a stop at the edge of the court. 2 police cars pulled into the parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing against the trees and casting a kaleidoscope of color across the nearby houses. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The lively chatter and laughter gave way to an eerie silence. Confusion settled over the group as the officers stepped out of their cars, their faces unreadable and their movements deliberate. The kids exchanged nervous glances. Maya whispered, "What's going on?" But no one had an answer. The officers, both in their 40s with stern expressions, approached the court. One of them, Officer Reed, adjusted his belt as he walked, while the other, Officer Jenkins, held a notepad in hand. "Hey, kids," Officer Reed called out, his tone firm but not harsh. "What are you doing out here?" Ethan, clutching the basketball, stepped forward hesitantly. We're just playing basketball, sir. Do you live around here?" Jenkins asked, his eyes scanning the group. "Do your parents know you're out here?" The kids, now standing in a nervous cluster, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir," Maya replied. "We all live in the neighborhood. We're just playing a game." Reed's expression didn't soften. "Who gave you permission to use this court?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to make Ethan flinch. "Permission?" Ethan repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "It's a public park. We've always played here." Jenkins flipped open his notepad, scribbling something as his partner continued. "We got a call about some noise complaints. You kids know anything about that?" The kids shook their heads, their nervousness growing with each passing second. Maya clutched Ethan's arm, and Lucas, The youngest of the group looked close to tears. They weren't sure what they had done wrong, but the presence of the officers, with their authoritative tone and scrutinizing stares, made them feel like criminals. The basketball rolled toward Reed's feet. He stopped it with his boot, picking it up and holding it in one hand. "So, whose ball is this?" he asked, looking at the group. "It's mine," Ethan admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Reed handed the ball back to him, but didn't say anything reassuring. Instead, he stepped back, his gaze shifting toward the park's entrance as if waiting for something or someone. Across the street, George sat stiffly on his porch, watching the scene unfold with a mix of unease and satisfaction. He told himself he had done the right thing, that this was about maintaining order, about keeping the peace in the neighborhood. But the sight of the officers questioning the kids, their small faces full of confusion and fear, gnawed at him in a way he didn't expect. Suddenly, a car pulled into the parking lot, its tires crunching on the gravel. It was a sleek black sedan, and out stepped Claire Sanders, George's daughter. She was dressed sharply in a navy blazer and slacks, her professional demeanor unmistakable even from a distance. George froze on his porch, his stomach sinking. He recognized the determined set of her jaw, the fire in her eyes. She had seen the flashing lights, and now she was here to find out what was going on. The kids, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, turned toward Claire as she approached the court. The officers noticed her, too, pausing in their questioning. "Excuse me," Claire said firmly, her voice calm but with an edge that demanded attention. "What's going on here?" Reed, caught off guard by her confident tone, hesitated. "Ma'am, we're responding to a call about a disturbance." "These are kids playing basketball in a public park," Claire interrupted, her words measured but pointed. "What kind of disturbance are we talking about?" Reed glanced at his partner before replying. "We got a noise complaint." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze shifting to the kids, then back to the officers. "A noise complaint," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "At a park, where kids are supposed to play." Jenkins opened his mouth to respond, but Claire wasn't done. "Let me be clear," she continued, her voice growing firmer. "These children have every right to be here. They're doing nothing wrong. If you're here because someone made an unfounded assumption about them, then maybe you should be asking questions elsewhere." The officers, clearly uncomfortable, exchanged another glance. Reed sighed, taking a step back. "Understood, ma'am. We'll be on our way." As the police retreated to their cars, Claire turned her attention to the kids. She crouched down, her face softening as she addressed them. "You're okay," she said gently. "Don't let this scare you. You didn't do anything wrong." The kids nodded, though they still seemed shaken. Claire stood up and walked across the street to where George sat, his coffee cup trembling slightly in his hand. As she marched up the steps, her expression shifted into one of cold fury. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "We need to talk. Right now." George's face paled as Claire stormed up the porch steps. He had seen this look before. Claire's unwavering determination paired with a simmering anger that left no room for excuses. He set his coffee cup down, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to brace himself for what was coming. "Claire," he began, his voice weak, "I was just trying to—" "Trying to what, Dad?" Claire cut him off, her voice rising but still controlled. "Trying to teach some kids a lesson? Trying to keep the neighborhood quiet? Or were you just trying to make yourself feel better by targeting a bunch of kids who've done absolutely nothing wrong?" George shrank under her glare. "They were making noise," he muttered, though even he didn't believe the words coming out of his mouth. "I thought they might be trouble." "Trouble?" Claire's voice cracked with disbelief. "You thought a group of kids playing basketball on a Saturday, in a park, were trouble? Do you hear yourself? What would you have done if those officers hadn't handled things as calmly as they did? What if this had gone differently?" George couldn't meet her eyes. He shifted in his chair, staring at the peeling paint on the porch railing instead. "I didn't think it would go that far," he said quietly. "That's the problem, Dad," Claire shot back. "You didn't think. You didn't stop to consider how your actions might affect those kids, how much harm you could have caused. You just assumed the worst and picked up the phone." She stepped closer, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. Do you know what that's like for them? To be treated like criminals just for existing? To have people assume they don't belong simply because of how they look? Because that's what you did. You didn't see a group of kids having fun. You saw something else. And that says more about you than it does about them. George felt his chest tighten as her words hit him like a blow. He had always seen himself as a decent, fair man. But now, faced with the truth of his actions, he realized how deeply his assumptions had shaped his behavior. He had judged those kids without even knowing them, and now his own daughter was holding up a mirror he couldn't look away from. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you did," Claire replied, her tone softer now, though still firm. "And it's not just about those kids. It's about you, Dad. It's about the way you see the world. You've spent so much time hiding behind your own bitterness and fear that you've forgotten how to see people for who they really are." George's hands clenched the arms of his chair. He felt the weight of her words pressing down on him, heavier than anything he had carried in years. "So what do I do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "How do I fix this?" Claire exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "You start by owning up to it," she said. "To yourself, to those kids, to this community. You can't change what you've done, but you can decide what you do next. And if you're willing to put in the work, maybe, just maybe, you can start to make things right." She stepped back, her eyes still locked on him, searching for any sign that her words were sinking in. George nodded slowly, the realization dawning on him that this wasn't just about apologizing. It was about changing, about confronting the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. "I'll try," he said finally, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I don't know how, but I'll try." "Good," Claire said, her tone softening further. "Because this isn't just about fixing today, Dad. It's about making sure this never happens again." She turned to leave but paused at the top of the steps, glancing back at him. "And for what it's worth," she added, "I believe you can do it. But you've got to prove it. To those kids, to me, and most importantly, to yourself." With that, Claire walked back to her car, leaving George alone on the porch. He sat there for a long time, staring at the now empty basketball court, his thoughts churning. He didn't know exactly what the path forward looked like, but for the first time, he understood that it was a path he had to take, and that it started with a single step. George stayed on the porch long after Claire left. The soft hum of a distant lawnmower and the chirping of birds filled the air, but it all felt muted compared to the weight of his thoughts. Her words echoed in his mind, circling around the core truth he couldn't escape. He had been wrong. And it wasn't just the kids who deserved better. It was himself. For years, George had let bitterness and isolation build walls around him, turning him into the man sitting there now. A man who called the police on children for laughing and playing. What kind of person have I become? He thought, the question rattling through his head like a loose bolt in a machine. The next morning, George decided to act. He didn't know where to start, but he figured the first step was simple. Face the people he had wronged. After brewing a pot of coffee, he poured himself a small cup and walked down his driveway toward the basketball court. It was early, the sun still low in the sky, but he knew the kids would be back before long. By mid-morning, the familiar sounds of bouncing basketballs and laughter returned. George stepped out from behind the trees near the edge of the court, holding his coffee cup in one hand and wiping his sweaty palm on his pants with the other. The kids noticed him immediately, their conversation dropping into uneasy murmurs. Ethan stopped dribbling, gripping the ball tightly, while Maya crossed her arms defensively. Hi," George said awkwardly, his voice cracking slightly. "Can I talk to you all for a minute?" The kids exchanged glances, their wary expressions making George feel like an intruder. "What do you want?" Maya asked, her voice flat, not hostile but not warm either. George swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their distrust. "I wanted to apologize," he began, "for what happened the other day. I made a mistake. I judged you without knowing you, and I called the police when I shouldn't have." The kids stayed silent, their expressions a mix of confusion and skepticism. George pressed on, determined to say what needed to be said. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice steadier now. I let my own fears and assumptions cloud my judgment. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for the way it made you feel. You didn't deserve that." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why did you do it?" he asked bluntly. George hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I was scared," he said finally. "Not of you, but of the changes happening around me. I let that fear turn into something ugly, and I took it out on you. I wish I hadn't, but I did." The kids exchanged glances again, their tension softening just a little. Lucas, the youngest, tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "He's saying sorry," the boy whispered. "Maybe he means it." Ethan nodded slowly, his grip on the basketball loosening. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Thanks for saying that. But you can't just do stuff like that again." "I won't," George promised, his voice firm. "And I'm going to do better. You have my word." The group stayed quiet for a moment, then Maya sighed. "Fine. But don't expect us to just forget about it." "I wouldn't," George said, relief washing over him. "Thank you for listening." He turned to leave, but Ethan called out to him. "Hey, Mr. Sanders." George stopped, looking back at the boy. "Yeah. Next time," Ethan said with a small grin. "Why don't you just come and play?" George chuckled softly, feeling a spark of warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Maybe I will." The day after George apologized to the kids, he sat alone at his kitchen table, a stack of unopened mail and a cold cup of coffee in front of him. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He stared out the window at the basketball court, still and empty in the early morning light. The memory of the kids' hesitant acceptance of his apology replayed in his mind. It had been a start, but it wasn't enough. George knew that words alone wouldn't fix what he had done. He had to take action, but he didn't know where to begin. That evening, he picked up the phone and called Claire. He hadn't expected her to answer. Half their conversations in the past year had gone straight to voicemail. But this time, she picked up on the second ring. "Dad," she said, her tone cautious. "What's going on?" George hesitated, gripping the phone tightly. I need your help," he admitted, his voice low. "I want to understand. I want to change." There was a pause on the other end. "Understand what?" Claire asked, though he could hear a glimmer of hope in her voice. "Everything," George said with a sigh. "Why I reacted the way I did. Why I judged those kids. How to stop thinking like that." For a moment, the line was silent, and George wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then Claire spoke, her voice softer now. "Okay," she said. "If you're serious about this, I can help. But you have to do the work. It's not going to be easy." "I know," George replied. "I'm ready." The next day, Claire showed up at George's house with a tote bag filled with books, articles, and pamphlets. She set them on the kitchen table, one by one, explaining each one as George listened attentively. Titles like White Fragility and The New Jim Crow stood out starkly against the plain wood grain of the table. "These are a good start," Claire said, pushing the books toward him. "But it's not just about reading. You need to listen to people's stories, their experiences. And you need to reflect on your own biases. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary." George nodded, though a pang of anxiety twisted in his chest. He had always thought of himself as a good man, someone who treated people fairly. Confronting the possibility that he had been wrong, that his actions had caused harm, felt like stepping into uncharted territory. That evening, George opened the first book, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. He read about systemic racism, implicit bias, and the ways in which society often treats people differently based on their skin color. Each chapter felt like a spotlight illuminating parts of himself he had kept in the shadows. It was painful, but it was also eye-opening. A week later, Claire suggested George attend a workshop on implicit bias at the local community center. At first, the idea terrified him. The thought of sitting in a room full of strangers, talking about race and prejudice, made him want to crawl back into his shell. But he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Walking into the workshop, George felt like everyone was staring at him, though most people barely glanced his way. He took a seat near the back, clutching a notebook he wasn't sure he would use. The facilitator, a warm and confident woman named Rachel, began by asking the group to share their reasons for attending. When it was George's turn, he hesitated, his palms sweating. He started, his voice shaky. I made a mistake. I judged some kids unfairly, and I want to understand why. I want to do better. Rachel nodded encouragingly. That's a brave step, she said. We're glad you're here. As the session went on, George listened to stories from people of different backgrounds, some about painful experiences with discrimination, others about the ways people had learned to confront their own biases. Each story chipped away at the walls George had built around himself. By the end of the session, he felt both raw and hopeful. Over the following weeks, George began to notice subtle changes in himself. He found himself paying more attention to the people around him, seeing them not as strangers but as individuals with their own stories. He started engaging with his neighbors, something he hadn't done in years. One afternoon, he saw Lucas and Maya walking home from the park and called out to them. "Hey kids," he said, a little awkwardly. "How was the game?" Maya raised an eyebrow but replied, "It was good. Ethan's getting better at free throws." George nodded, smiling. "That's great to hear. Keep at it." It was a small exchange, but it felt monumental to George. He was no longer watching from the sidelines. He was starting to participate. At Claire's suggestion, George began volunteering at the community center. His first task was helping organize a youth basketball tournament. It was far from glamorous, mostly setting up chairs and cleaning the court, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As the tournament progressed, George found himself drawn to the kids, especially the ones from his neighborhood. He offered tips on shooting form, encouraged them when they missed a shot, and even joined in on a few games. The kids were hesitant at first, but over time, they began to accept him. One day, after a particularly intense game, Ethan approached George with a grin. "You're not bad, Mr. Sanders," he said. "You ever think about coaching?" George laughed, the sound surprising even him. "I think I've got a lot to learn before I can call myself a coach," he said. "But thanks, Ethan. That means a lot."